can you see me? Oh, here I am. Nice to see you. Ah, whoa! I like these ears. These ears are very cool. Whoops! Just me. All right, hi, it's Jonathan. You know me, Jonathan Swift. I was from the Enlightenment era, 1700 to 1800 on the dot. New Year's to New Year's, 100 years of enlightenment. Pretty cool, you might say. Well, just wait till you hear all about me. I was an essayist, satirist, poet, political mastermind of the press, cleric. Yeah, I was pretty cool, not to toot my own horn, but you know. I'm supposed to take you on a little trip through literary history. Just hold on to your hats, folks. It's going to be quick. Ooh, the Renaissance era, late 1500s through the 1600s. As you know, at the time the church was in charge, well, at least until the Pope got in the way of Henry VIII, who wanted to get married yet again, and so in retaliation, Henry VIII created the Church of England. Ha ha ha, very cool. But meanwhile, in Germany, we had our first printing press. All exciting stuff. So let's look at who was in charge at the time. Definitely the king. This is Hampton Court Palace in London, and this is a church in a little city called Wells, UK. Well, I'm sure that Henry had something even better in London. Meanwhile, the common folks were living like this, in little hovels. It's easy to tell who had the money. Alright, so here are the people you know from the Renaissance era. John Donne, William Shakespeare, John Webster. Common conventions of the time, apostrophe, which as you remember is an address to something that can't answer you back. Extended metaphors, also known as conceit. Elevated diction, wit, conceits. Formulaic poetry, especially the sonnet. However, change was in the wind. Paradise Lost by John Milton, written at the very end of the Renaissance period, pointed out an interesting change. Milton was inspired by classical sources such as Homer and Virgil to write a lengthy saga on biblical themes. He wanted to, quote, defend God to man. That was the first time that sort of relationship was suggested. Da-da-da-da, the age of enlightenment, my time. Oh, and here I am. Aren't I handsome? Aren't I beautiful? Anyway, the big ideas were the rise of humanism, a philosophy that put humans at the center of history rather than God, reliance on classical logic, reasoning, and art for inspiration for our own time, the beginning of an uneasy relationship between church and science. When Henry VIII created his own church in rebellion against the central church based in Rome, he did other things as well. He made it okay to disagree with the central church. It might not make you popular, but it wouldn't get you burnt. Alright, this is St. Martin's in the Field, created by James Gibbs, an architect, in 1722. If you look at this church, you'll notice that it looks a little bit like a Greek temple. Yes, it has the spire reaching to heaven that you would have seen in medieval or Renaissance cathedrals. However, it is definitely inspired by classical sources. People you would know: Isaac Newton, Samuel Johnson, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Pope, the only great poet of this time. Common conventions, references to the classics, just as common or more so than biblical references, rise of satire, conversational diction, focus on orderly form, especially in essays. Remember St. Martin's and how it is perfectly symmetrical? That is the sort of symmetry that we were seeking in all of our art, even writing. Oh, but rebellion is on the way. The Romantics are coming. Da-da-da! 1800 to 1850. Their big ideas were that they didn't want to focus on the mind and symmetry and logic anymore. They wanted to focus on imagination and emotion. They thought that nature was an unsullied moral influence on humans. There's people that you know from this time period: Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, the Bronte sisters, Nathaniel Hawthorne, the great American, Walt Whitman, also a great American, Edgar Allan Poe, a great American, Herman Melville, American, Lord Byron, British, ha! Here's Walt Whitman, looking very sassy in his beard. Edgar Allan Poe, definitely a looker. Or maybe not. Anyway, let's look at a piece of art from the time. See how it creates atmosphere and everything is not necessarily well defined or symmetrical. Oh my goodness. There's a train coming towards us. Remember that, because there's something else that will change in our next period of history. Common conventions of the time, apostrophes to nature, as if nature could possibly answer back. Byronic heroes. Remember Lord Byron, which we mentioned before? He was a poet, but inspired by him, there was a convention of heroes that were naturally flawed, but also doing their best to improve themselves. Atmosphere and setting as almost a new character in the novels, creating an influence on the characters themselves. Bold, fascinating imagery that created pictures, sort of like the landscape we saw before by William Turner. Creative use of symbolism throughout novels in order to emphasize larger themes and ideas in the book. Transcendentalism. Now, transcendentalism was mostly an American movement in the northeast of the USA, took the love of nature even further. It was originally based on German philosophy, however, it's found its own in the Alcott family, Henry Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now, Henry Thoreau wrote a whole book about his experiences of living back in nature for an extensive period of time, thinking that that would bring him closer to natural good. Look at this painting by Frank Church. You notice that it's a bit realistic, but it focuses on the unsullied beauty of nature. There is no sign of humans in the picture. Then we had realism, roughly from 1829 to 1920. Now, the big ideas were they were trying to rebel against romanticism. They wanted to show things as they really were, not as how they seemed through emotional lenses. The common conventions were the realists liked to focus on characters and detail. They had linear plots without major rising action and falling action, because the story was really about the people, not about what happened to them. They tried to report events without bias towards or against their main characters. There's a person you know very well from this time called Mark Twain, or Samuel Clemens. Now, Mark Twain created a variation of realism, using folksy characters and vernacular diction. He went as far as to create written dialects based on real dialects that managed to read well off the page while giving the essence of how people actually talked. Naturalism was the next step. It wasn't exactly a rebellion, but an outgrowth of realism. It explored why characters were who they were. There was a sense of fate to naturalism, a sense that your environment and your family created who you were, and you couldn't change yourself. Quite a change from my own time, which focused on self-made men. Later naturalists were inspired by Darwinist principles. This painting, The Drowned by Vasily Perov, from 1867, is stark, uncompromising, and gives us a sense of why these people might be who they are. Look at the man smoking on his pipe. He seems to match the city in the background, which also is uncompassionate. The birds flying past with little sense of the tragedy in their midst. People you know from the time. Stephen Crane and Jack London. Stephen Crane's book, The Red Badge of Courage, set during the Civil War, was supposed to be a portrait of fear, creating a sense of what it was like to be in a terrifying situation, but without bias towards or against the characters, yet giving a sense of why they acted the way they did. Now we're embarking on a very confusing time period, quite long, 1837 to 1901. This time period was marked by the reign of Queen Victoria in London. She lived quite a long time, reigned quite a long time. The time was one of exploration, imperialism, huge explosions in wealth and middle class, lots of literacy, almost everyone could read. Old morals maintained without inner conviction. Conventions were not consistent. Oscar Wilde led a movement that had art for its own art's sake. There were traces of romanticism, but overall you can say that the Victorian period was marked by an active plot, reoccurring characters, use of exotic settings, or maybe not, maybe just a drawing room, neutral diction. The poetry was often telling stories as well, sometimes in the form of a ballad. People you know from the time. Conan Doyle, H.G. Wells, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Oscar Wilde, Lewis Carroll, Charles. Modernism was the next step from naturalism, 1910 to the present. The big ideas were this era was deeply influenced by the lost generation, a whole generation of men who either did not survive or barely survived yet maimed the First World War. There was a focus on inner life, but without the healing influence of nature. There was an overall sense of disillusionment, and there was much experimentation with form and style. The people you know from the era are F. Scott Fitzgerald, T.S. Eliot, William Faulkner, Ernest Hemingway, and Langston Hughes. Let's look at this painting by Pablo Picasso. The women are portrayed in seductive poses. However, the artist's treatment make them far from alluring, even perhaps disappointing. Common conventions include synesthesia, stream of consciousness, character-focused stories, try to explain reality, however badly, focus on individualism, and the poetry was often blank or free verse. Existentialism, 1850 to the present, was another philosophical movement asking such questions as, is there meaning in the world? How do we know? There was a struggle with mentally knowing and trusting anything. It affected writers throughout history. It's best expressed by this painting, The Scream by Edvard Munch, 1893. Or maybe this, the person you may know, Samuel Beckett, Waiting for Godot. Now, Samuel Beckett was an Irish playwright who wrote plays where nothing really happened. In Waiting for Godot, two people wait on stage for God. In the course of 2 hours, nothing happens. Right after World War II, another generation exited and found a world they didn't really like. The big ideas were they were disillusioned with American ideals, rejected materialism. There was a rise of hippie and drug culture as well as a sexual revolution. The people you may know, Allen Ginsberg, Jack Krusak, and William Burroughs. Common conventions, poetry as sound apart from meaning, colloquial or neutral diction, drug-inspired artistic process. Here is a little bit of a very famous poem called How by Allen Ginsberg. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix. Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo and the machinery of night, who, poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high, sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats, floating across the tops of cities, contemplating jazz, who bared their brains to heaven under the L, and saw Mohammedan angels staggering on tenement roofs, illuminated, who passed through universities with radiant, cool eyes, hallucinating Arkansas and Blake, light tragedy among the scholars of war. Postmodernism is the era you may be most familiar with, as it is your own. The big ideas roughly are, we must find our own meaning. Look at this painting by Jackson Pollock, 1952. It is not representational. There is little form, but yet, in a way, it harkens to us, as we understand the confusion and the many different layers of color and emotion. There is no pattern or providence other than what works for you. This can be expressed in a variety of styles, using techniques from any period of time. Well, Jonathan Swift here, hoping that you've enjoyed our journey through history.